In this episode, we take the operational risk context you established and use it to identify the threats, events, vulnerabilities, and impacts that genuinely matter in production, rather than the ones that simply sound scary or theoretically possible. Beginners often struggle here because operational environments generate a constant stream of noise, and without a disciplined filter, everything can feel equally urgent. The phrase that matter is the key, because operational risk work is not a contest to list the most dangers. It is an effort to focus attention on the pathways that can realistically harm mission outcomes. Production systems have real users, real data, real dependencies, and real constraints, and those realities shape which threats are plausible, which events are likely, which vulnerabilities are most dangerous, and which impacts are unacceptable. When you identify these elements with operational focus, you make monitoring and response sharper because you are watching for the patterns that actually lead to harm. You also make communication easier because you can explain why a certain weakness deserves immediate effort while another can be scheduled later. The goal is to build a clear, defensible picture of operational risk drivers that supports decisions every day, not just during a formal assessment. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Operational threats are best understood as sources of harm that can realistically reach your production environment, and that realism comes from your system's access paths, trust relationships, and dependencies. In operations, threats include intentional human adversaries, but they also include insiders making mistakes, automation failures, vendor disruptions, and environmental factors like power and network instability. The beginner mistake is to describe threats in broad categories, like hackers, which does not help operational teams decide what to watch for or how to prioritize controls. Instead, you want to describe threats in terms of their relationship to your system, such as credential theft targeting remote access accounts, abuse of exposed application interfaces, misuse of privileged administrative roles, or compromise of a vendor update channel. For non-malicious threats, you might describe accidental deletion of critical data, misconfigured access permissions during routine changes, or capacity exhaustion during peak demand. Engineering precision in an operational setting means you choose threat descriptions that reflect what can actually happen given the system's boundaries and normal behavior. This is how you avoid building a monitoring posture that is impressive on paper but blind to the threats that are most likely to cause mission harm. Operational events are the concrete happenings that occur in production, and they are where abstract threats become real timelines. An event might be a user login, a password reset, a configuration change, a software update, an unusual traffic spike, or a series of failed authentication attempts. Events can be normal, abnormal, benign, or harmful, and operational risk work depends on recognizing which event patterns indicate growing exposure. Beginners sometimes treat events as only security alerts, but in production, events include routine operational actions that can trigger incidents when controls are weak. For example, a routine change can accidentally remove a protective rule, and a routine account creation can accidentally grant broad privileges. Operational events also include failure events, like a service restart loop, a storage failure, or a monitoring pipeline outage, because those events can reduce visibility and increase risk even if no attacker is present. Identifying operational events that matter means focusing on those that are closely connected to mission-critical functions, privileged actions, and boundary crossings where trust is granted. When you know which events matter, you can define what signals you need and what response actions should be triggered when those signals appear. Operational vulnerabilities are weaknesses that are not merely present, but reachable and meaningful given how the system operates. A vulnerability that exists in an unused component might be less urgent than a smaller weakness in a heavily used access path. In production, operational vulnerabilities often include misconfigurations, overly broad permissions, weak separation between administrative and user roles, incomplete logging coverage, and fragile change processes. They also include dependency vulnerabilities, such as reliance on a vendor service without sufficient visibility into its health or security updates. A major beginner misunderstanding is thinking vulnerabilities are only technical flaws, when in operations, a process weakness can be just as dangerous as a software bug. For example, if emergency access is frequently granted without later review, that process becomes a vulnerability because privileges accumulate and create hidden attack paths. If incident response roles are unclear, that is a vulnerability because it increases time to detect and repair, increasing impact. Identifying operational vulnerabilities that matter, therefore, means looking at how controls behave under real constraints, where shortcuts happen, where monitoring is incomplete, and where responsibilities are unclear. Operational impacts are the consequences that actually harm mission outcomes, and they should be described in a way that reflects production reality rather than generic fear. In production, availability impacts are often the most visible, such as an outage that blocks users from completing a critical workflow, but integrity and confidentiality impacts can be more damaging over time. Integrity impact in operations might mean corrupted records that cause incorrect decisions, delayed service, or unsafe outcomes, especially when the system's outputs are trusted by downstream processes. Confidentiality impact might mean exposure of sensitive records that triggers mandatory reporting, legal action, and loss of trust, but it can also mean smaller exposures that accumulate and erode credibility. Operational impact also includes secondary consequences, like the cost and disruption of incident response, the need to shut down services to contain harm, and the backlog created when normal work is paused. Beginners should learn to connect impact to the specific mission function, such as this integrity failure could cause incorrect processing decisions for critical transactions, or this outage could delay mission delivery for a defined group of users. When impacts are described this way, leaders can prioritize them and operational teams can respond with the right urgency. To ensure you focus on what matters, you must connect threats, events, vulnerabilities, and impacts into plausible operational risk scenarios, not as stories for entertainment, but as chains of cause and effect. A common operational chain might begin with credential theft as a threat, proceed to an event like suspicious logins from unusual locations, exploit a vulnerability like lack of strong authentication or overly permissive roles, and produce impact like unauthorized access to sensitive data. Another chain might begin with a non-malicious threat like a rush change window, proceed to an event like a configuration update, exploit a vulnerability like inadequate change validation, and produce impact like a service outage that blocks mission workflows. The value of these chains is that they show where you can intervene, such as strengthening authentication, tightening roles, improving monitoring, or improving change controls. They also help teams agree on what signals to watch and what thresholds matter, because you can identify the points where the chain becomes hard to stop. For beginners, chaining is the technique that turns isolated facts into operational understanding. Because production environments are noisy, you also need a way to prioritize which chains deserve attention first. Prioritization is driven by mission criticality, exposure level, and the feasibility of mitigation, not by the drama of the scenario. A risk chain that affects a core mission workflow deserves more attention than one that affects a non-essential feature, even if the non-essential feature has more frequent minor issues. A chain that involves privileged access deserves attention because it can amplify impact quickly, even if it is less likely. A chain that has poor detection, meaning long time to detect, deserves attention because it can silently worsen over time. Prioritization also considers whether mitigations are realistic under operational constraints, because a perfect control that cannot be sustained becomes an operational vulnerability. Beginners should learn that prioritization is not ignoring. It is sequencing, and sequencing is necessary because resources are finite. When you choose priorities based on context and evidence, you build a risk posture that improves steadily rather than lurching between crises. Operational identification must also account for how systems drift, because what matters today can change next month without a major redesign. Drift can occur when new integrations are added, when user roles expand, when exceptions become routine, or when monitoring coverage erodes during upgrades. Operational threats can change when attacker behavior shifts, and operational vulnerabilities can change when new software versions introduce new weaknesses or remove old safeguards. That means identification is not a one-time exercise. It is a recurring practice that revisits the system's most important pathways and asks whether the assumptions still hold. Beginners often think repeating analysis means the original work was wrong, but in operations, repeating analysis is how you keep the work true as reality changes. Each cycle should refine understanding, reveal new dependencies, and adjust priorities based on what has been observed. When identification becomes routine, operational teams become better at noticing early signs of risk growth, and leaders become more confident that risk posture reflects real conditions. Another important operational lens is considering which vulnerabilities are likely to be exploited inadvertently by normal operations, because not every harmful outcome requires an attacker. A missing backup verification process can turn a routine failure into a major data loss incident. A fragile deployment pipeline can turn a standard update into a service outage. A confusing access request process can lead to overpermissioning that persists for months. These operational vulnerabilities create impacts that feel like security incidents, even if the root cause is process and reliability failure. Identifying these matters because they compete for the same response resources and they can mask real attacker activity by generating constant disruptions. A stable, well-managed operational environment is often more secure because it reduces chaos, and chaos is where both mistakes and attackers thrive. Beginners should understand that operational risk work aims to reduce chaos by strengthening the system's ability to fail safely and recover predictably. When you capture operational threats, events, vulnerabilities, and impacts, it is also important to phrase them in a way that is actionable for monitoring and decision-making. That means avoiding vague labels and instead describing observable conditions and plausible outcomes. For example, instead of saying insider threat, you might describe misuse of privileged access outside approved workflows, which can be monitored through access logs and change records. Instead of saying denial of service risk, you might describe capacity exhaustion during peak demand, which can be monitored through performance metrics and traffic patterns. Actionable phrasing also supports documentation leaders can defend because it shows that risk statements are tied to evidence and can be verified. This reduces the chance that risk discussions become subjective debates because people can point to specific signals and thresholds. It also makes it easier to track whether mitigations worked because you can see whether the observable condition has changed. Operational precision is therefore as much about language discipline as it is about technical understanding. The overarching lesson is that identifying what matters in operations requires context-driven focus, not encyclopedic security knowledge. You start with mission outcomes and production realities. Then you identify threats that can reach the system, events that indicate harm pathways, vulnerabilities that are reachable and meaningful, and impacts that truly damage mission delivery. You connect these elements into plausible chains so you can prioritize monitoring and controls that break the chains early. You revisit the identification regularly because systems drift, dependencies change, and threats evolve. And you keep the language observable and actionable so decisions and monitoring can be consistent. When you do this, operational risk management becomes calmer and more effective because the team is not chasing noise or reacting to headlines, but managing a grounded set of risk drivers. That is how production systems stay aligned with mission outcomes even when reality shifts. And it is how you turn risk work into an operational discipline that actually prevents harm instead of simply describing it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.